This podcast was sponsored by and recorded at Crossings Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening to us today. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing. My name is Rob Henderson, and I'm the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial Anglican Church in London. We're the big blue church in the corner of Southdale and Wellington. And we're back again with Revi Kevi. How you doing?
Kevi is here. Kevin George, rector at, where am I now? St. Aidan's Church?
That's where you are
St.
now.
Aidan's on Oxford Street
That's
West.
right.
And but right now I'm like you. We're both high priest of the Crossings Bar and Eatery.
That's right. So we're here with producer Ian. How we doing, Ian?
I'm alive.
You're alive and well,
Yeah.
enjoying your March break?
Yeah.
Ian said this was the first day of the week he didn't just sleep all day.
Oh,
He had
Well,
to
I don't
actually get
sleep
up.
all day.
He
I actually
had to get up and help around the house.
No, I don't sleep all day. I actually do set an alarm for like 10:30, which is like a decent time. But
10:30.
but hey,
But to have an alarm for 10:30?
He has to put an
Man,
alarm
I don't
on
know
for
what that is.
10:30.
I don't
know
like
what that is.
oversleeping, but I had to drive my dad to work so I could have the car.
Okay.
So I was up to drive him to work, and I just haven't been back to sleep.
Okay,
So,
good.
fair
enough,
Well,
fair enough.
We'll keep drinking the coffee.
Let's be
over
honest.
there
Yeah.
and
Let's
keep
be
you
honest. If we were that age, we'd be in bed too.
up. Oh, I would too.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I was not that age, I would.
I'd be in
have
bed if
nothing
I
to
could
do.
be,
I'd still
but-
be in bed sleeping. And no, we're glad you're here with us again. Back at it at Crossings Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park Road in London. And today we're welcoming a very special guest to our program, Kasia Kalarus. Kasia, nice to see you.
Nice to have me here.
Thank you. Thank you. We're glad you're aboard. And Kevin's do you want to do a little intro on Kasia
well,
before we
because-
we get into all of our stuff that she'll have no interest in?
Right.
But you
So
go right ahead.
Kasia is a young professional here in town that I got to know because she's a nurse, and I happened to run across needing a nurse.
From time to time.
Hard to believe that I might need a nurse, but I have my own parish nurse just for emergencies actually. But he can't travel with me all the time.
That's right. So Kasia's here.
Yeah. So when I go see my family doctor. But a little bit about her. Kasia was born in Poland, came to Canada at the age of 3, and born into a European Roman Catholic family, which is really where her platform for spirituality started. And as I've gotten to know Kasia, I've come to understand her as somebody who really has a deep spirituality. And like so many people nowadays, is what I would describe as a spiritual seeker and somebody who really sort of explores deep questions. Usually when I see her, whether it's because of health concerns or just because I run into a friend, she's reading something which is really quite good.
Right.
And she's also always quite interested to hear what I'm reading, which, you know,
Well, you're now reading a
book.
book that she recommended.
I am
right?
reading
Or an
I have-
author.
That's
Yeah.
right. I have a book here now that Kasia recommended. It's called On Binding, which is not a nursing book about anybody's. It's not that sort of on binding.
No, we don't want to get into that.
But Kathleen Dowling Singh is a great author. More about her later when we talk. But Kasia is just somebody constantly exploring to search for truth and the reality of the universe and the bigger picture. And because of that, I always enjoy having company with her.
Good.
And I thought, you know what, she'd be good company for our listeners too.
Very much so.
Welcome,
Yeah,
Kasia.
yeah.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for having me here.
Great.
Feel honored.
It's good. 'Cause this is great. This is something that is one of the joys of ministry is being able to hear people's stories, their spiritual journeys, their faith stories, where they're from, and they're all different. That's the amazing thing. You can sit down with 100 people and get 100 different stories about different paths people are on. So to be able to have a forum like this, to have Kasia in to kind of share a bit of hers, I know our listeners will be resonating with some things as well as we get into that. So we're looking
Definitely.
forward to hearing from her. So what's been going on with you?
Me?
Did you just get back from knitting?
Yes, I was knitting this afternoon.
had
Actually,
knitting
well, I
class.
didn't actually knit because the woman who protects my knitting
Yeah.
is away. Like she
Okay.
takes my knitting away so I don't lose it and stuff. You know what I'm like. I lose a lot of things.
Yeah,
The
once in a
people who
while.
listen to this who actually know me know I've lost hats, wallets, scarves, coats. You know, I'm lucky I haven't lost my life actually. But I lose a lot
Losing
of
your
things.
knitting would be a whole new level.
That's
wouldn't
right,
it?
yeah. So, but anyway, we're very fortunate, and they finally come up with a name for themselves. They call themselves a tight knit group.
Well, there you
That's
go.
And
awesome.
Perfect.
and they're a group of mostly, not entirely, those seniors who've come together through our Silver Saints Seniors Ministry, and it started quite organically. What's really cool about it is I think there were 18 of them over there when I was just there now, and they've knitted their first prayer shawl. Everybody knits a little square, and then they all get stitched together, 18 of them, and they're sent out to people regardless of sort of faith and whatever too, but anybody who's struggling or sick, and they can hold it on their lap, and there's a little sort of a prayer that goes along with it, but it's not particularly a Christian prayer. It's just a note to remind people that they're being thought of, although it does have that sort of language around it. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I was stopping in on that, and I jokingly said when I went, it was sort of like a sweatshop when I went in. I mean, there were people going crazy in there. I mean, the production was incredible.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
So I really am quite pleased by it. So we got that going on. And a big thing for us is last night we went and we helped reunite a Yazidi family.
Yeah, what was up with that?
Well, it's pretty cool. It was a 15-year-old girl. We have a Yazidi family. We're helping a mother and 2 children who came here just over a year ago. And the Yazidis are a very small religious sect in northern Iraq. Who are heavily persecuted by ISIS. And there's only, I think, about 70,000 of them over there between Syria and Iraq. And these folks were captured 5 years ago as a family, mother and 2 daughters and a young son. And she had an older son who would have been about 12 at the time. And he and his father were captured, and they've either been forced to go to war or, God help us, who knows what. They've never been found. And but the 2 young girls, or the 2 young children, the young boy and a young girl, came with their mom about a year and a half, 2 years ago. But they haven't seen their older sister in 4 years because she was sold back and forth into different hands of ISIS people in the last 4 years for unspeakable horror. And but she surfaced about 4 months ago, and her captors demanded ransom, and somehow or another extended family in the village there managed that, and she was released. And she flew into Pearson last night, and I drove Mom and the 2 younger siblings down there, and we picked her up. Wow. And it was quite a scene.
Wow. That's incredible.
Wow.
And we got there, right at about the time the flight arrived, but it took another 2.5 hours for her to be processed. So to see those 3 standing at the glass, with their hands on the glass, peering in, waiting for her to come through the door, and they've been waiting for years, and just to see mom and child. I mean, honestly, we all wept like crazy. It was just,
it's really incredible to hear you say that. Am I allowed to talk?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
You're allowed to talk.
I just think it's really incredible to hear you say that, because I think there's so much, I guess, political correctness about refugees, and there's so much talk about all that, and I don't think people hear those stories. I don't know what they think when they think refugees, but I've heard it all, like, oh, when I came to Canada they didn't give me handouts, and it's like, do you realize that these people are coming from worn, torn, violent countries, right? And that's
terribly
not to say,
persecuted.
Exactly, right? It just it strikes me that I think if people saw the reality, right?
I would challenge
what that
anybody to
looks
stand
like.
where I stood last night and watch that reunion and say, she shouldn't have come here.
Right. And that's the thing, to hear the human story behind some of these folks that are coming over here.
Yeah, it's a very ignorant
you'd be
view
thinking
to not
different.
take a look at all that.
It really
It
was.
was a pretty, to me, it boils down to, it's just what, for those of us who follow Jesus, it's what Jesus would call us to do, welcome strangers. So,
exactly.
So it was pretty moving. But you must have some stuff going on out at...
always. We're always busy and doing things. We're in the season of Lent right now. So one of the things that we like to do in Lent
And
is...
that's not the stuff you get in your belly button?
No, it's not.
Okay.
That's another vowel.
That's Lent.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's Lent. We're doing a book study right now, and a book that I know you've worked with before. It's by an author by the name of Brian McLaren, and it's called The Great Spiritual Migration.
Excellent
And
book.
so we've had about 20 folks out together to just start that this week, and it's a really interesting book about Brian's call to Christianity as a whole to migrate into a different place as Christians, not just as the church or not just as denominations per se, but to find ways, especially in organized religion, that we're so well at organizing ourselves to kind of keep ourselves in our little buildings.
Silos,
But what would it be like for us, and this is one of the things he talks about, what would it be like for us to organize ourselves as Christians for the greater common good?
That's right.
Because there's things going on outside of our doors that oftentimes that we don't organize around enough to take care of, like refugees,
That's right.
like climate change, these types of things. So it's kind of
It's a cool
expand your
book.
mind a little bit about those types of issues. And so we've just got underway with that. And looking forward
Glad
to
to
that.
hear you're doing that. That's a great book.
Yeah, so that's just
We've
one thing
done that
going
here
on.
in this room.
In this very room.
In
Well,
this
yeah,
very
you're
room,
right.
we
Yeah,
brought
yeah,
them
yeah.
here and we
Okay.
drank beer and we discussed that book from our
Okay,
church.
okay, good.
And they loved it, and I'm sure your group
Yeah.
will too,
Yeah,
because
like
it
I
is
said,
that
we're-
push that sort of goes, that encourages communities to go beyond belief and
Right.
and not worry so much about what people believe, to
Right.
see what people are doing.
Right.
And what if our churches were schools of love?
Right,
Yes.
schools of love, exactly, and that's where it starts at. And I always love doing these studies because inevitably every time, especially after the first one, everybody kind of gets up and looks at each other and goes, "Geez, I never even thought of that."
Yep.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
to
no,
me,
it breaks
that's
people's
the key.
minds open,
yeah,
yeah.
it breaks their minds open, and then they get excited about
Yeah.
where it could be leading them. And so anyway, that's
Yeah, cool,
that's
man.
good. Yeah, looking forward to that. So it's time for a special segment on our show.
Ooh-hoo.
It's time
It's
for
that new segment.
That's right. AIA. Ask Ian anything.
Round 3, let's go.
Round
All
3.
right.
Here we go. So Kevin's got a question from a celebrity.
I do, in
Kevin.
fact, quite a well-respected local celebrity here in the London community and host of the morning show on CJBK, Ken Eastwood,
Ah.
has sent me along via Facebook Messenger a message for our very own producer, Ian.
Wow.
In fact, he sent several, so we're going to give him 2 questions today.
Oh, man.
2 questions, okay? Are you
Okay,
ready for this?
I'm so ready. Let's go.
Okay. First one is, what is the most inappropriate thing that has been said during a podcast so far?
Move on to the second one, please.
I'm not going to say it, but it was with, the World War II veteran.
George.
Oh, yes.
George.
yes.
George Beardshaw.
George
Was like our
Beardshaw.
third guest or
Yeah,
something.
George
Oh.
Beardshaw.
Give it a listen. It's a
Oh,
wild
yeah.
ride.
Yeah, we had to do some editing, didn't we?
Yeah.
Holy cow, yeah.
That guy, he's 95,
95 or something.
World War
yeah.
II vet.
He's lived it all.
He
yeah.
was.
He speaks his mind. We'll say that.
That's
let's
good. At
just
that point, I don't think you care anymore,
Let's
right?
just say that he colored the air blue in this room. So,
Took me like all night to finish that
Right,
one.
edit
Wow.
that, Yeah.
Next question is, how has doing this podcast changed your outlook on God or faith or spirituality? You pick the word. Good questions from Ken Eastwood. Thank
Yeah,
you for
wow.
those
Thank
questions, Ken.
Thank you, young Ken.
It really hasn't. I don't know. Like, I have
So
my
there,
own.
Ken.
No, like, I have my own sort of ideas of what God or whatever should be and what sort of religion and spirituality is. And sort of this podcast is not a way of changing my mind, but a way of sort of expressing it.
Yeah.
You know? And that's what
Nicely
it
done.
should be.
Nicely
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for some like quantum physics questions
Yeah.
too. So if you're
That's right.
listening out there and you got some
If you're a
quantum physics-
mathematician.
So, ladies and
Send them
gentlemen,
along.
boys and
Oof.
girls, men and women, this has been Ask Ian Anything. Another successful edition.
Brought to you again by us.
Us, yes,
Amazing.
we did this, yeah.
That's right.
I think it was brought to us by A Voluptuous God,
A voluptuous God.
which is the title of a book I have here on the table. I didn't make that up myself, but subtitle I like too is A Christian Heretic Speaks, which could be the subtitle of this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway.
Exactly.
So, getting into some discussion here, Kasia, we've had many discussions, you and I, about spirituality since I've come to know you, and I've been very impressed with the depth of your questions, actually. And you first got to see me. We were talking before we began recording about first meeting me, and I'm in a collar and a formal suit, and that brings its own set of expectations. of what
That's a
people
good way
think.
to say it, yeah.
Right? There's a set of expectations around that, and it's why I'm not often found in it sometimes, quite frankly. But there are times it's appropriate. But your thought process I find to be deeply meaningful. I know you grew up in a church, and that I think it will be fair to say that you've evolved from that place of where you grew up in the church.
That's a good way to say it, yeah.
And what those early beginnings have been. And you share, I'm wondering if you can share with us and with our listeners a sense of your upbringing and what your memories of church or religion were as you grew up as a child in the church.
So, it's actually interesting that you say memories, because just kind of thinking back, when I was presented with some of the questions we were going to be talking about today, I kind of thought, oh man, like that's a challenging question. Don't know how I'm going to answer that. And then
She broke the fifth wall. It's supposed to be a surprise.
oh, I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry.
kidding.
It's non-scripted. None of this is scripted.
There are no surprises around here.
And it's very interesting because I actually had a memory come back to me, and I gotta say that growing up in the Roman Catholic Church, I can use the word sterile. I think it was very sterile. I grew up in a family that, you know, was very wholehearted. They really believe in that stuff. They're very, you know, dedicated to their faith, and I was too growing up. You know, I really believed everything that I was told, and I really wanted to meet this God that they always talked about meeting, you know, in church. And I specifically had a memory come back to me where I was sitting, you know, in the pew, you're kneeling while the priest is, you know, blessing the sacrament, you know, bread turning into the body of Christ. And I just remember sitting there, you know, like imagining like this Holy Spirit coming down, because that's what they tell you happens. And I just remember thinking like that I had to imagine it. Like I wanted it so badly. I wanted it so badly to be true. And I can't tell you how old I was. I don't know, maybe grade 8 or grade 9. And, you know, then my experiences with the church, you know, initially they were really good. But the older I got, the more I kind of realized the problems that were in not just our church, but I think in a lot of different churches. More so about, you know, the older I got, the more there were, you know, the more sayings were, you know, make sure to dress appropriately for church, and what are people going to think of you if you know, like your shoulders are showing, and
There's nothing worse than a shoulder.
That's right? Or like, and so that
I get really excited when I see shoulders too. I'm just saying. Sorry to interrupt.
That kind of
now
mentality.
I can't get shoulders out of my mind. Sorry. Go ahead, Kasia.
That kind of mentality always kind of troubled me, because I always wondered, you know, I thought we were here to learn about God, and I thought we were here to learn about loving one another and all the teachings, because like that's how I viewed church. But the older I got, the more I really realized that people are, you know, when they consider themselves Roman Catholic, they consider themselves, you know, good followers of the rules. And that's what I kind of mean by sterile. I wasn't seeing by people's actions all this religious stuff that they were talking about, loving one another, you know, some of the views the church has on you know, different things, you know, I find troubling, and because they're divisive, they don't proclaim love. And I thought that's literally what Jesus's message was about, right? I thought that's what God was. They're always talking about, you know, he's love, we should be doing his work. And so I gotta say that's where I started to question things, and eventually I began to I think it was hokum, for lack of a better word.
My father used to say bunkum.
Bunkum. I've never heard that one.
That's Newfoundland for you.
Yeah.
He had some other words too that would give George Beardshaw a run for his money.
That's right.
Yeah, I kind of started thinking, like, you know, like, am I just believing something that isn't real? And then I had other experiences that kind of led me to spirituality and stuff like that. So that's when I think my faith, I guess you can say, or my spirituality or my connection to something beyond really grew. It took life. It became alive. I was trying to find what that was, instead of, you know, trying to follow some rules that made me a good Christian or not.
So
right?
the as you said, the God that was being proclaimed, or the Jesus that you were hearing about, was not evident or visible within
people's actions.
Within the people you were around, or
That's
it was more an external thing.
That's right. And I began to think, you know, are they just making this up because it's making them feel better about life? I didn't know those answers, and that's not meant to insult anyone. Those were questions I had, right? I wondered, what is this all about that they're so wholeheartedly believing, but I can't even see it. Like, what am I missing?
Did you feel comfortable at the time, or if you can look back this and remember, did you feel comfortable at the time, or have someone to go to pose those questions?
No,
or you kind of felt that's not something you even
No, I just did all that on my own.
Yeah.
My boyfriend at the time, now my fiance, I would kind of talk a little bit about it to him, but I even saw that because he doesn't have a vested interest in this stuff, right? He kind of didn't really understand what I was talking about either, like all the ideas I had, or the one book I found that kind of I thought maybe was talking about some kind of truth. What is this truth that I've discovered? what does it all mean? And he wasn't that interested, right? So it was just me. It was a personal journey, which I think that's what everyone is on anyway, right? It's the Roman Catholic Church talks about it, a personal relationship with God. Other religions talk about, dissolving of the self, merging with, the source, all these different things. I think they're all using the same words to describe something that maybe is unique to our human experience. Maybe it's something bigger than us. I'm not sure.
I think, too, the interesting thing about what you said there is, and I hasten to sort of, I guess, add that, I don't hear what you're saying as a condemnation of the church, but the church was not, at this point that you were in your life and the age that you were and the questions that you had wasn't necessarily the fertile ground for you to be able to do all that.
No. And I should add, though, I don't think that all churches are like this either. I think just like any religion or any even one person, you've got the good apples and the bad apples.
Sure.
Or you've got the people who are more interested in a spiritual journey versus more interested in following the rules, right? So it's whoever's leading the church, and they're all
right. And depending on the priest that you're dealing with too, right, it makes a difference.
Yeah, so true.
So, but the part that jumped out at me in terms of what you were saying was that when you began to ask those really deeply meaningful questions, and you all of a sudden, it wasn't, for want of a better term, we talk about it in our church sometimes as a Sunday school faith, that it wasn't like, well, here are the stories and believe it like it is. It was when you started to go, well, is that really what this is? Or
when the question becomes,
when it really became
that's
a
when it breaks
deep,
open.
burning question, that's when you really started to have some deeply spiritual interaction with yourself, with your creator, with whatever language you want to use. But that's when you began to explore the real meaningful questions. What's the meaning of life? Why am I here? What is this all about? And then the sort of things that you're reading now as you've moved along that path are really quite deep and provocative things. So it would seem to me that it is ironically that moment when you say, I'm not sure if I believe this the way they're giving it to me.
Right.
That's the moment that something starts to begin to spark in your faith.
Well, you know what?
Faith is not the right word,
I
perhaps.
think I actually remember the very moment where I think it, like, the switch really clicked, where I was like literally I thought, like, oh God, I think this is hoax. I'm like, what have I been kind of listening to all this time? I just remember thinking, I was a nurse, you're learning about medical conditions, you're learning about everything. University is a very stressful time. We all deal with certain things in university, mental health wise and everything. Everyone's going through, just a crap load of stress, really.
Sure.
For lack of a better word. I just remember thinking, in church they always talk about like suicide, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Suicide is a sin, and I don't know whether I heard this in like what do they call in a sermon. I can't remember where I heard this, but I just remember thinking, if that the belief is that God or whatever it is that created us, if he's created us to have all of these conditions, or whether life has, cultivated us to have these conditions, whatever, why would one be condemned for having such a condition? Why would someone in such misery who takes their own life be condemned? It didn't make sense to me, and I thought that's not the all-loving God that they talk about, their disconnects in their messages.
And I think that the churches, in the Roman Catholic Church, Anglican Church, others, we've all had in our past this sort of backwards theology about suicide. I'm happy to say I see that evolving. I mean, certainly in our own church, and I know from hanging out in Roman Catholic Church with Catherine Ann, I mean, we've tended to these things that's not the prevailing attitude.
Yeah,
but
and that's
the
good.
problem is that, again, you deal with individuals, as you say. We've got colleagues. I mean, you just never know where people's own theology is. I guess. But
and it goes back to and something from our book study that came up last night when we were talking about it. When you start to question, oftentimes you'll hear voices say, "Stop questioning, just believe or think what we tell you, and you'll be fine. You don't have to think about."
I was told I was too smart for my own good, and I'm like, what?
But the
Why
thing
didn't
is,
I ask the question?
By a man?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
I was going to say that could have been another thing.
But what came out of it was the idea. Yeah, what came out of our discussion last night was the idea that your questions are faithful.
Yes.
By the very nature of the fact that you want to break this stuff open and ask questions,
it's a faithful response.
Says that you get it, that you're willing to step into the questions and the mystery, and allow God or spirit or whatever name you want to put around it,
Yeah.
to enter into that and walk with you in the mystery of it all.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So the questions are faithful.
Yeah.
Don't ever think
Yeah.
that they're not.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the stuff we're often trying to call people into, right? But instead,
Right.
what we get is people who want rigidity instead,
Right.
Anyway,
It's like that one song.
which one?
The one that, sorry, just jumping in right now.
Well, no, you should. You're like one of the key pillars of this whole thing is producer Ian. You can have your own segment. Do I have my segment? I don't have a segment. Do you have a
I
segment?
haven't have a
Your whole
segment.
podcast
Only-
is a segment.
Oh,
Ian's
got his own segment.
Fancy. Anyway, so there's a song called Trees.
By?
21 Pilots. I'll link it in the description of wherever. Anyway, and some of the lyrics goes, why won't you speak where I happen to be, silent in the trees, standing cowardly? And it's like, the song topic is basically, I'm standing here in the middle of the trees. Why can't I say hi? Like, where's the general conversation with this superior being? Like, why can't I share a sandwich with you, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Deep longing.
Yeah.
That's
That deep
incredible,
longing.
Ian.
Yeah. No, it's good stuff.
Yeah. I didn't write it, but it's a good song.
No,
But you
it's
listen
good.
to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You probably sang it.
I have.
I knew it.
There you go.
So
Kevin has said that your faith has evolved, obviously, over the years, and we've kind of touched on that a little bit, and oftentimes it does come from the questions and wonderings. And I understand that through your explorations and your desire to kind of get away from traditional Christianity, as we understand it, and in your search for truth, you found the writings of different people and in different places, names like Eckhart Tolle, who I'm familiar with and have read his work, really like his stuff, but also in Buddhist writings and Hindu writings and Jewish writings as well, and things like that. And you found them all to be helpful. And in all of that, you somehow, though, as well found kind of a new appreciation for this Jesus that you perhaps had heard about as a young child but weren't seeing, but you kind of saw that connection in there. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really interesting because I say this a lot to anybody who's willing to listen. But
well, there's like
now there's
there are
a lot of
millions.
you.
There are millions
now.
millions listening to you right now. Like our listenership is got to be like it's probably approaching 1 trillion. Right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I just find it really interesting because I think a lot of people are scared, maybe is the right word, or I don't know what the right word would be, but they stick to their traditions, whatever faith they're from, and they view that as like the ultimate truth. And I don't know if there is the ultimate truth in any religion, but they all, I find, are very similar in the things that they say. When you like really read the stuff, you really notice and even Eckhart Tolle's works, that's really what struck me, is that they all are very similarly saying the same thing. They just use very different words to describe very similar spiritual experiences or common situations that human beings experience. And I gotta say, that is what really brought me back to thinking, maybe this person, Jesus, who is here, I wonder if he discovered these truths as well, and he was trying to bring it to the masses. And, before I questioned, was he even a real character? Was he something, there's so many different scholarly works on him, whether or not he existed, whether or not he was, a byproduct of a society, whether or not he was even a real person. And it's just very interesting. It brought me back to some of the things that I've read in, that he talks about in, his book, in the Bible. And it sounds very similar to the things that are being said in a lot of these other spiritual traditions. And you hear it so much more now in the spiritual world. You've got all these authors like this, the book on binding and other things. They're literally saying the same message. And you kind of begin to think like, did they tap into something that is the truth and they're trying to tell people about it? And does it have to be this secretive thing that only one person can attain? No, it's probably something we can all attain. This connection to something beyond ourselves, whatever that is.
I think one of the common threads that I've found in these different writings as well is the common thread is the human experience and what it is to be human. And it's and Jesus talked about it in many ways, and some of the other traditions as well. And that's definitely a thread that. So when you're talking about them all together like that, and Eckhart Tolle puts that in a lot of his writings, and can talk about a certain human experience and find different ways that that different faiths and religions kind of connect those human experiences. So those things together are all very common. Yeah.
Okay, what comes to mind too, one of the interesting books is called Living Buddha, Living Christ.
Oh yes, that one was a good one.
Yeah, and it's, it's written by, and I won't say the name right.
I
but
can never say his name. He's like a favorite Buddhist monk of
Thich
mine.
Nhat Hanh, I believe is how
Yeah.
it's said, but he's a Buddhist monk and writer. And what he does in the book is outline the words of Jesus as quoted in the Gospels. And he parallels those to a lot of Buddhist teaching, where the words sometimes are just eerily almost the same. And so that's incredible.
There's a lot of really interesting similarities between Buddhism and Christianity that I didn't really realize until I kind of, started exploring that world as well. Like they have prayer beads, which looks so remarkably similar to, the rosary.
Yes.
Right? And you begin to kind of, I don't know, ask yourself some questions, Jesus is missing from the Bible for 30 years, right? You begin to ask yourself, was there some kind of influences? And I'm not saying there were, I'm not saying there weren't, but
Well, there are scholars who actually
yes, there
write
are
that.
scholars.
Yeah.
It's very interesting stuff, right? So you begin to sometimes put the pieces together, whether or not you're putting them together to make yourself feel better or not. But just exploring all these different works really kind of goes to show you that we're not all different from one another. We're all seeking something, and we're seeking a connection to something. And like, where on earth does that come from? It comes. She talks about it in the book Unbinding,
Yes,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And we
What
all
is the-
experience death. We experience restlessness. We experience grief. We experience joy, and questions.
Right.
And
And
that's the thread.
And if you read Bhagavad Gita, if you read the Hebrew Scriptures, Jesus quoted the Hebrew Scriptures, the Psalms a lot, because the Psalms really the psalmist is really expressing the human experience, as Rob was talking about. And it sometimes is messy, and it's ugly, and it's hard to deal with. It's what it looks like to see a 15-year-old girl reunited with her mother, knowing what she's experienced in the last 4 years. It's really the messy stuff of life, and being present to people in the middle of that is sort of was important enough to Jesus in his own passion. He quoted those words, right? So there is something to the notion that we're able to sort of bring those things to a place where, and in terms of interfaith work, it's where we're able to make the most progress. Is sorry, that was producer Ian. My apologies for him.
There goes my phone.
But it's the where we make most progress in the interfaith work, multi-faith experiences, is when we're able to sort of see those commonalities,
Right.
and they always are rooted in the human expression of how we're living out of this condition,
Right.
and it's really powerful stuff.
And we can get together and disagree on all the different ideas around what it says or means or how to go about it. But at the end of the day, when we all sit around with each other and say that person needs to be fed,
Yeah,
all that other stuff doesn't matter.
that's right.
Right. Exactly.
It's the understanding that
Yeah.
the human need is to take care of that person
Yeah.
where they're at. Yeah.
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 One of the writers we mentioned a couple times now, Kathleen Dowling Singh, and let me borrow
Wanna borrow my pen?
No, I want to borrow that sheet of paper you got.
Oh,
there.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
go
because
ahead.
I've got a problem. You know what happens when your iPad battery goes dead? Can't read what's on it. And so anyway, one of the authors that we've been talking about is Kathleen Dowling Singh, and you put me onto her book Unbinding, The Grace Beyond Self. And she was most well known, this book is very new, but she was most well known for her books The Grace in Dying, The Grace in Aging, and The Grace in Living. And what's quite interesting is she wrote them in that order. She didn't start with The Grace in Living. She didn't start with and then move on to The Grace in Aging and then The Grace in Dying. She began with dying and then backed her way up in terms of the experience. And one of the reasons is because her life was immersed in hospice work and palliative care. And so the human condition that she was most familiar with on a day-to-day basis was this business of dying. And as she plumbed the depths of what that meant, and she was able to sort of get to that place of better understanding, she wrote about it. And became a sort of a seminal book for a lot of people who work in the hospice world. And then once she'd sort of gotten there, she started to figure out, what does it look like for people who know they're dying to live with aging, because that aging itself is dying. And then once she'd plumbed the depths of that, she moved back another layer and said, okay, well, let's talk about the grace in living. Her last book, which was published right about the time of her death, there's 2 months apart in between that and her death, is called On Binding, as I mentioned. And your recommendation, I picked it up. I hadn't read it, and I've been reading it, and it's a great book. One of my favorite spiritual writers is a guy named Ron Rolheiser. Ron is a Oblate Roman Catholic priest. He's the head of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas, and we've had an opportunity to spend time with him these past couple of years, Catherine Ann and I, when we've traveled there for a conference. He writes great books too, and he was quite fond of Kathleen and her work, and he actually says of her, "We've lost a great woman and a great spiritual writer." Her children, he quotes, writing on Facebook after her death, said simply that their mother would want us all to know that she was, quote, an ordinary person doing an ordinary person dying an ordinary death. But, he says, the spiritual legacy she left us is far from ordinary. I wonder if you can share a little bit about your interaction with Kathleen's writing, being, I think this is your introduction to her writing this book.
Yes, it was.
And what is it about her writing and what she's had to say that's appealed to you?
Well, I got to say, when I actually found that book, I actually found it at the Mandela Bookshop, which is a little super cute place in town. It's got all these books on spirituality and literally everything you could imagine.
This podcast brought to you by Mandela Bookshop.
Right. Got to name drop them, right?
Yeah, sure.
But I saw it on the shelf, and I was looking around for something to buy. I always like kind of stumbling in there. And when I saw the title, I knew exactly what that book was about. It struck me as a manual on how to unbind, basically not from this life, but when you read it, you could get the picture of what she's talking about for those of you who may not understand that term. But that's really what spoke to me about it, and I didn't know all this extra stuff about her that you had told me about, which is quite interesting. I found it very interesting what you said about what her children wrote about her, that she was an ordinary person living an ordinary,
dying an ordinary death.
Yeah. And I mean, this is heretic to say, I guess, but I honestly think that since we're talking about, within a Christian realm, I honestly think that's probably what happened with Jesus as well. He was a person who discovered probably these insights that she has found. That's kind of maybe too quick to say that, but he also died and left behind a spiritual legacy, right? And so to think that he was the only special one doing this, I think is divisive. A lot of people from different parts of the world have probably stumbled across these things. This lady was a hospice worker, right? She was face to face with these situations all the time, which brings about the human condition like you're talking about. And I could only think that through the millennia that, we've been around, people have not discovered these kinds of insights and it tried to bring them to the masses, tried to leave behind these spiritual legacies. Every faith has these people who try and bring this to the masses because they discovered something, right? And it's the same thing with her, right? She quite powerful in what she writes about.
Well, these become exemplars of our faith, right?
Exactly.
And
They live the message.
And you're quite right to say that. I mean, because church has always proclaimed that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, and there's been a lot of weight over the centuries placed on the divinity of Jesus as the Christ.
Right.
But when you read the stories that are attributable to the parables, for instance, or you read what he did, his interactions with the sick, the rejected, the lonely, the lepers, those that know the societal outcast.
It's proclaiming love, really.
That's right,
And
and hanging out
acceptance.
I mean, some people have said that he would have been considered a glutton and a drunkard for hanging out with the wrong folks, and so the notion that what you're hitting on there in terms of drawing that line between Kathleen's work and the way that she lived it. I don't know that much about her, but I know that she probably had some Christian upbringing, and it's that sort of stuff I think that is most meaningful, at least for me. What I take away from both my Sunday school faith that I was given as a child in a way, but that only takes you so far. It was when I really began to plumb the difficult questions, the kind of ones that you were talking about earlier, that I began to sort of break some of this open. And then so for me, the personhood of Jesus, who he was and his willingness to enter into the messiness of life and be present in places that nobody else would go, is really what sort of is fundamental to how we live our faith. We are called to be people who imitate the way of Jesus.
And one thing to kind of say on that, I think, I think if he was around now, I don't think you'd ever recognize him. He would be that person,
Pretty
on
radical
the
for most people.
Right. He'd be that person on the street that no one knows about, being with those that are, our most vulnerable populations. And I think it's really interesting how I think this message of love and, understanding somehow has gotten lost in his work. I think a lot of people are about, worshiping instead of doing his work,
Right.
I guess is a good way to say it. I firmly believe in, loving, understanding, and compassionate care, right? Compassion through understanding.
Right.
And I think that's just what working with the most vulnerable populations really means, is kind of
Definitely.
that message, right?
Yeah.
Kind of rambling here,
That's
trying to
okay.
get
You're
a
not
point
rambling at
across.
Rob's got another one for you, I think.
Do I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
More questions?
So yeah, just kind of, we're going to be wrapping things up in a couple of minutes. So just want to talk a little bit for a moment about your work as a health practitioner. It's what it keeps your days busy. You're a nurse. How would you say that your spirituality has played a role for you in your daily life and in your work? Because it's hard for any of us. I don't think we ever really separate the two per se, that somehow they intersect. What's that been like for you?
Okay, yeah. At first I was kind of like, I don't know how I'm going to answer this question. I just kind of thought to myself, like, I don't think I really joined the two. But then when I kind of thought about it a little bit, I realized that I guess my approach just in general to life has been understanding, or I should say compassion through understanding, and trying to meet people where they are. And I think I've learned forgiveness, for example, because forgiveness is a journey. It's not something you just, it's like not like a line you cross. I've heard it referred to as that. I've explored that concept, and through a lot of, like the Buddhist work that I've read, and Eckhart Tolle and countless other authors, they kind of preach this message of, you can't really understand what someone else is going through until you go through it yourself. Or you can't really understand where that person is coming from, and therefore, it's really easy to judge. But just taking a little bit of time to try and understand the situation can bring you down to their level, and when you just offer some, I don't know, kind of like a kind ear to listen to some of the issues that they're having, I think people open up because they realize, like, you're there to listen, you're there to help,
Right.
and you're not there to judge or scrutinize their life. Right. I think that's probably the best way that I can describe how I
In a sense, what I
live
hear you
that.
saying is you're able to, in your work as a nurse, create sacred space or safe space.
Maybe that's a good way,
for
a safe
people
space.
to bring
Right.
themselves and
Right.
what is oftentimes vulnerable things
Right.
To you. And in that space, your checklist is not about where they work or how much money they have or those types of things. It's about what is the need in that moment and how can I address it and bring health and with compassion and love and create a space for them to be able to heal, right?
Right.
And if I can say a word about that, I mean, without going too far into it.
Yeah.
I just say that
As one who has experienced
as one who's
this,
actually
yeah.
experienced it and had to walk into your office and sit there, it's the sort of person that I'd hope from a Christian perspective, if I had to think, well, what does somebody who exercises their Christianity look like as a nurse? Then I feel very confident that the person that I see in my doctor's office who offers professional care to me is somebody who's living to the fullest of what I would expect out of somebody who's living the tenets of Christianity.
It's really interesting that you say that. Thank you, but I guess so I'm a little flattered, right? But at the same time, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I would say that my not attitude towards it, but my approach comes from the roots of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so it's just, even there you go, it kind of to show you that all these religions are preaching the same
In
thing,
part it
right?
does, but don't underestimate the early seeds of what was planted in you in the Roman Catholic Church.
Those seeds, I gotta say, I didn't take them that way. So
No, but one of the things you said to me not so long ago is about that kicking and screaming back at the doors of what Christianity is.
that I
yeah.
kind of got back there.
Right. So there's the, when you talk about how you've read all this stuff, but now you see what Jesus was saying and so on. So I think, to go back to what Rob said earlier when he was talking, once you started breaking those questions open, that's when the real stuff started. Well, sometimes perhaps the church is too slow to embrace that. I agree that's true, but sometimes maybe that's the crucible we need to actually get moving. I don't look at it as positive or negative. I just look at it as a fact of life. So if what's happened in my life is the church has challenged me in a way that it's like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to hang out here on Sunday morning because it's not the right thing for me. I think that's the Spirit's way of saying, what do I need to do now, and where does the question go? Right. And so if that's been something that's helped me refine who I am and what I believe, then that's not all bad either.
I saw an interesting quote, which kind of makes me think of what you were just talking about. I think I sent it to you, actually.
Yes.
I found it, I read it, and I was like, this really sums it up. There are, if we're talking about in Christian terms, the ways to God, or other religions say it very differently. But the quote was that there are many trails that lead to the top of the mountain. And the only person wasting time is the person who's running around the base telling people that their trail is wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just so many ways to get to
Start
the
climbing.
ultimate truth, right? Start climbing, wherever
right,
you
yeah.
are, whichever denomination, religion, faith, if it's not non-faith, right? Whatever routes you find, whether it's just a spiritual book you pick up and you ask questions, right? So.
Just to clue up, I'll offer this quote out of this book that Kasia has recommended people read, which again is called Unbinding, The Grace Beyond Self, Kathleen Dowling-Singh. And I think this is actually something that many traditions would again honor and agree with. Our experience of existence is most often lived trapped and bound, believing in a limited and mistaken sense of the totality of who we are. Endless energy is spent comparing, judging, strategizing, manipulating, preening, and defending our own ego. It's exhausting and it's stressful. Ultimately, ego is illusory. It's not the truth of our being. We believe ourselves to be so much less than we actually are.
When I read this book, when I started reading this book, I immediately kind of thought, my goodness, this is like, she's using different words, but I felt like I was reading The Power of Now again, the book by Eckhart Tolle, which was kind of like really the thing that cracked open my journey to spirituality. And I just found it really interesting because, once again, right, you can take that and I'm sure lots of different religions kind of talk about the same thing,
Hard
right?
to disagree with us there.
That's right? It's like the human experience that you're kind of referring to, right?
Yeah.
Good. Well, Kasia, like I said at the beginning, one of the great joys of ministry and about doing this podcast is that we get an opportunity to enter into people's stories and share ideas and thoughts. And so we're thrilled that you could come in and spend a little time with us and do with that
Thank you so much
today.
for having
thank
me.
You.
This was
It
great.
was good. We enjoyed that.
Yeah, we'd have to have you back.
Kevin, where are we?
I'm happy to.
You got to tell people where they can
Where
find
are
us,
we?
right?
Well, we're in
Because
Crossings Pub right now, where I see you've been enjoying a nice lager. Somebody has been giving up
I
beer.
have a lager from
I noticed
Ace Hill.
you didn't
Yeah.
give up beer for Lent.
I did not.
No,
No,
but I
no.
have. But he's got a nice Ace Hill there, and you can find that and much more here at Crossings. But beyond finding us here, you found us if you're listening to this on some app. But we're happy to announce we're now on Tuned In as well. If you're one of those
That's
people
right.
that use a Tuned In app, then you can get us there. The other one is called Buzz Squeeze.
Sprout.
Buzz Sprout. Sorry, I did
Sprout
it.
Squeeze.
It's Buzz.
Close enough.
Let's call the
Yeah,
whole
no,
thing
it's
off.
Buzz Sprout. Is another app that people use or a platform for podcast. But of course, you'll find us on YouTube, SoundCloud, and right now on iTunes
Also on Spotify.
and on Spotify. Yeah, if you're a Spotifyer, you'll definitely find us
You'll
there.
spot us there.
And
And don't forget to
we want to
send
hear
in-
from you, right?
Yeah, and don't forget to send in any questions for Ask Ian Anything. You can do that as well. vicarscrossing@gmail.com.
Or you can
is
tweet
our
us
email.
at
You can tweet
Crossing.
us at Vickers Crossing.
At Vickers
Or
Crossing,
you can
yes.
find us on Facebook, The Vickers Crossing.
Or you can send up a smoke signal.
You can do that too.
Or you can go to Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial here in London, Ontario. You can go to St. Aidan's Church here in London, Ontario.
And drop off your questions.
Or you might find us here at the bar at Crossings.
You
That's
very well
Crossings
may.
in Hyde Park, folks.
That's right. Good,
Yeah.
good. Well, we'll look forward to getting together again next time. So thanks everybody for being here. And until we gather at the Vickers Crossing, remember to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Catherine Olenek. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing, or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!